The excavation site buzzed with excitement under the blazing sun as archaeologists and researchers moved in and out of the shadows cast by ancient ruins hidden deep within the South American jungle. Doctor? Jack Marsden stood apart from the crowd, his gaze fixed on a strange stone half buried in the earth at his feet. Its surface glimmered faintly as though catching light from an unseen source, and strange symbols spiraled across it, forming intricate patterns that drew the eye like a magnet. Dr. Marsden over here, called Elena Reyes, his lead researcher and a local expert on the region. She had been the one to pinpoint this location based on local legends and folk tales that spoke of a forbidden relic hidden somewhere beneath the jungle canopy. Elena was young, sharp-eyed, and relentless in her pursuit of the unknown, and Jack had learned to trust her instincts more than his own. She gestured to him to come over, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear mingled with awe. Jack approached slowly, his boots crunching over broken bits of stone and foliage as he reached her side.
"What is it?" he asked, though his voice held more curiosity than concern.
He had seen countless relics in his life, yet something about this stone felt different, ancient in a way that defied the usual explanations. Elena pointed to the strange object now cleared of earth and vines. The stone was smooth except for the symbols, which glowed faintly, as if they pulsed with an inner life of their own. Jack felt a strange pull toward it, like a whisper at the edge of his mind, urging him to reach out to touch it. "They say this place is cursed," Elena murmured, her voice barely audible. "The elders warned us that anyone who finds the murmuring stone is bound to it forever." Jack let out a small laugh, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. "Cursed stones are part of the job," he said with a half-hearted grin. "But this one, well, it does feel different." As Jack extended his hand toward the stone, a shiver ran through him. His fingers barely brushed its surface when the world seemed to fall away, the noise of the sight fading, until there was only silence, a vast and all-encompassing void. Then the symbols shifted, reconfiguring themselves as though responding to his touch. In that moment, a voice spoke in his mind, not in any language he knew, but in something deeper, primal, like an instinct. It was not a single voice, but many layered atop one another, a chorus of whispers, each word fading into the next. The only word he could make out was a name. His name. Jack. He stumbled back, snapping out of his trance, his breath coming fast and shallow. Elena reached out, steadying him, her eyes wide with worry. "Dr. Marsden, are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Before he could answer, a new voice cut through the air, one that made Jack's blood run cold. "Dr. Victor Harker, the financier of the expedition, and a man with far too much interest in Jack's research for comfort, stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the stone with an expression of barely concealed greed. Well, Jack, what have we found here?" Harker said, his tone smooth but laced with something darker. He had arrived at the site unannounced, a habit he had perfected during his years of lurking around archaeological discoveries, always on the lookout for the next big find that could pad his reputation and his bank account. Harker's eyes lit up as he studied the stone, his fingers twitching as though resisting the urge to touch it himself. "I think we're onto something groundbreaking here, wouldn't you agree, Jack?" he said, flashing a smile that held no warmth. Jack straightened, forcing himself to appear calm. "It's certainly unique," he replied carefully. He knew Harker would stop at nothing to claim the stone for himself if he sensed its value, and Jack wasn't about to let him. Elena watched the exchange silently, her gaze shifting between Jack and Harker as though piecing together a puzzle of her own. She had heard rumors about Harker's involvement in other expeditions and the odd disappearances that followed his discoveries. This stone, whatever it was, felt like something that carried a heavy price. As the day wore on, Jack felt the pull of the stone intensify, each glance at the symbols stirring faint memories from the edges of his mind, as if he had known this language in another life. Harker and Elena seemed affected as well, each drawn to the stone in their own way, one by greed, the other by fear. That night Jack couldn't sleep. The whispers lingered in his mind, haunting him with fragments of meaning half understood. He rose from his bed and made his way back to the site under the cover of darkness, his footsteps muffled by the thick jungle underbrush. He wasn't surprised to find Elena waiting there, her figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the stone. "You feel it too, don't you?" she said softly without turning around. Jack nodded, unsure of what to say. He felt a kinship with her in that moment, a shared understanding that transcended words. But as he stepped closer, he caught a movement out of the corner of his eye. Harker stood at the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the stone, a strange gleam in his eyes as though he understood more than he let on. "We're not alone here," Harker said, his voice low and steady. "This stone is speaking to us all, and it's offering something none of us can resist." Jack felt the pull of the stone again, stronger than before, a force that tugged at his memories, his mind, his very identity. He looked at Elena, then at Harker, both of whom seemed equally transfixed, their eyes locked onto the shifting symbols with a hunger that mirrored his own. And as the three of them stood there in silence, he understood one thing with chilling clarity. This was no ordinary artifact. It was something alive, something that fed off their thoughts, their memories, binding them to it with every glance, every whisper. But the stone's true purpose remained hidden, a mystery waiting to unravel. And Jack knew that whatever it was, it had only just begun. By morning, the entire site seemed to pulse with an energy none of them could ignore. The air was thick with an invisible tension, as if the jungle itself sensed the artifact's presence and was holding its breath. Jack, Elena, and Harker stood by the stone, each of them feeling its pull, yet each experiencing it in a way they couldn't fully explain to the others. For Jack, the stone was a whisper of forgotten languages, fragments of symbols he somehow recognized yet could not place. For Elena, it was a force that called to her, but with a feeling of dread, as if stepping closer would strip away her very essence. And for Harker, it was something more sinister, a lure promising power and knowledge beyond human understanding. As they prepared to examine the artifact further, Jack noticed Harker pulling a notebook from his bag. Harker's hands trembled slightly as he scrawled in it, his gaze flickering back to the stone. Jack knew the man was no scientist, he was a businessman, here to claim what he could for himself. But something in Harker's expression seemed lost. "What are you writing?" Jack asked, suspicion tinging his voice. Harker snapped the notebook shut, his gaze cold. "Notes for later," he said, a forced smile crossing his face. "Just documenting my observations." Jack exchanged a glance with Elena, who raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Something about Harker's sudden interest in detailed documentation felt off. They all knew that the artifact was affecting them in strange ways, but none of them wanted to admit just how deeply it had already seeped into their minds. Elena turned her attention back to the stone, taking a deep breath. "I don't think we fully understand what we're dealing with here," she said, her voice steady. It's as if the stone wants something from us." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I've spent years studying artifacts, but nothing has ever felt this alive," Harker scoffed, though there was an edge of fear in his laughter. "Alive? It's a stone. Jack, a very valuable one. Yes, but still just a stone." Jack shook his head, sensing that Harker's words were more for himself than for them. The pull of the stone was undeniable, and they all knew it. Jack had barely slept, haunted by visions of symbols dancing before his eyes, memories he couldn't place, dreams that felt like they belonged to someone else. As the day wore on, Jack and Elena continued their work, documenting the stone's markings and trying to make sense of its strange energy. But each time Jack traced a new symbol, he felt a faint sense of loss, as if a piece of himself had faded, slipping away unnoticed. It wasn't until he tried to recall his family back home that he realized how deeply the artifact had affected him. The image of his brother's face, once clear, was now blurred, his name slipping from Jack's memory like water through his fingers. Panicked, Jack glanced over at Elena. "Do you remember your family?" he asked, his voice low. Elena frowned, searching her mind, but her expression turned troubled. I know I have a sister, but I can't remember her name." Her hand went to her head, as if trying to force the memories back. "It's like it's right there, but every time I reach for it, it's gone." They both looked at Harker, who was scribbling furiously in his notebook, his face a mask of concentration. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Harker, usually so confident and arrogant, looked desperate. He was writing as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. "What's happening to us?" Elena whispered, fear clouding her eyes. "It's the stone," Jack replied, his voice barely audible. "It's taking our memories. Every time we study it, every time we touch it, we lose something." Elena pulled her hand back from the stone, her face pale. "But why? Why would it do that?" Jack shook his head, feeling a growing dread settle over him. He didn't have answers, only questions that seemed to multiply the longer they stayed in the artifact's presence. The day dragged on, each of them trying in vain to understand the symbols, piecing together fragments that refused to form a whole. By evening, Harker's behavior had grown erratic. He paced around the stone, muttering under his breath, his notebook clenched tightly in his hand. "Elena, Jack, we're on the verge of something here," Harker said, his voice barely controlled. "Can't you feel it? The stone, this language, it's offering us a chance to become something more, to understand things no one else ever has. But you're both afraid. You don't want to take the risk." Jack watched him warily, seeing the madness beginning to flicker in Harker's eyes. "And what risk are you willing to take?" "Harker?" he asked, his voice steady. "Your memories? Your mind?" Harker smirked, though there was a twitch in his expression. "If that's the cost, then so be it. Knowledge is worth any price. Jack, you, of all people, should understand that." Before Jack could respond, Harker turned back to the stone, his hands trembling as he pressed his fingers against the symbols. He muttered words that made no sense, words that sounded like fragments of the alien language that none of them truly understood. A flash of light pulsed from the stone, and Harker staggered back, clutching his head. For a moment, he stood there, his eyes unfocused, his mouth moving soundlessly. Then he looked up at them, his gaze blank, a hollow shell of the man he had been. "Elena, Jack." Harker's voice was a whisper, a plea. "Who am I?" Jack's heart sank. Harker's memories, his entire sense of self, were gone, stripped away by the stone, leaving him empty, lost. Harker stumbled backward, his notebook slipping from his grasp, falling open to reveal pages upon pages of meaningless scribbles. Elena reached out, her hand trembling, but Jack pulled her back, his own fear taking hold. "Don't touch him. We don't know what's happening." Harker's gaze shifted, his eyes glassy, as if trying to remember something just out of reach. "The stone, it knows everything. I thought I could—" His voice trailed off, and he collapsed to the ground, his eyes vacant, his mind seemingly shattered. In that moment, Jack understood the price the stone demanded. The knowledge it offered was not a gift, but a trap, consuming the memories of those who sought to unravel its secrets. The more they learned, the more they lost, leaving nothing but empty shells in its wake. He turned to Elena, his resolve hardening. "We have to leave. Elena, this place, this stone, it's not meant for us." But Elena hesitated, her gaze drawn back to the artifact, her expression conflicted. The stone's glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, its whispers filling the air, calling her name with a seductive promise of knowledge beyond her wildest dreams. As Jack pulled her away, he felt the weight of the stone's gaze on him, a silent reminder that he had barely escaped with his own mind intact. And as they left the clearing, he knew that whatever the stone's true purpose was, it had claimed one of them already. But Jack sensed that its hunger was far from satisfied, and with every step, he felt its presence lingering in his mind, like an echo that refused to fade, a voice he would never fully escape. They left the clearing, Harker's empty gaze haunting them as they retreated into the shadows of the dense jungle. Every step felt like moving through a fog, the whispers of the stone still echoing in Jack's mind, a strange and relentless pull he couldn't quite shake. Elena walked beside him, her face pale, her eyes distant. They had barely escaped the artifact's influence, yet both of them sensed they hadn't left it fully behind. Once they reached camp, Jack collapsed onto a fallen log, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, but the strange symbols danced in his mind, refusing to disappear. Each symbol seemed to pulse, to shift, as if imprinting themselves permanently in his memory. "We need to tell someone about this," Elena said finally, her voice quiet yet resolute. "This thing can't just stay here, waiting for the next person to stumble upon it." Jack opened his eyes, looking at her, seeing the shadows of doubt and fear mingling with determination. She was right. Of course. The stone's power was too dangerous, too unpredictable, but he couldn't shake the feeling that once they left, the stone would call to someone else, drawing them in just as it had done to him, to Elena, and to Harker. "It won't let us go that easily," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. I feel it still. It's like a piece of it is inside me. Elena looked at him sharply, her expression shifting to something unreadable. Do you think that maybe it's bound to us now? Like we're somehow connected? Jack shook his head, though he knew deep down that she was right. The stone had touched them in ways they couldn't fully understand, embedding itself in their minds, their memories, as if claiming them as part of its legacy. He didn't know if he would ever be able to free himself from it, but he knew they had to try. Maybe, if we bury it, Jack suggested, his voice filled with a hollow hope. If we seal it somehow, maybe that will be enough. Elena nodded, and together they gathered supplies, a tarp, ropes, shovels, anything that might help them contain the artifact. They worked in silence, their minds focused, their movements almost mechanical. They were both exhausted, mentally and physically, yet the urgency of the task drove them forward. As they reached the clearing, Jack felt a wave of dread wash over him. The stone sat where they had left it, its surface gleaming in the moonlight, the symbols shifting in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The air around it felt charged, alive, as if the stone were waiting, watching, aware of their every move. Without speaking, they began to dig a hole near the base of a large tree, their hands moving in tandem as they worked. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. It felt as if time itself had slowed, trapping them in a moment that stretched on indefinitely. Finally, the hole was deep enough. Jack wiped the sweat from his forehead, glancing at Elena. Are you ready? He asked, his voice thick with exhaustion and something else, fear. Elena hesitated, her gaze fixed on the stone, her expression conflicted. Do you feel it too? She whispered. It's like it's calling to me. Jack nodded, feeling the same pull, the same relentless urge to reach out, to touch the stone one last time. He forced himself to look away, focusing on the task at hand, reminding himself of the cost they had already paid. Together, they lifted the stone, feeling its strange warmth radiate through their hands. For a brief moment, Jack's mind flooded with images of vast alien city, towering structures made of light and shadow, voices speaking in a language older than time, the memories of an ancient civilization, lost to history, lingering in the stone's depths. They lowered the artifact into the hole, covering it with dirt, pressing down the earth until the glow was barely visible beneath the surface. As they worked, Jack felt a strange sense of loss, as though he were burying a part of himself, a piece of knowledge he would never fully understand. When they finished, they stepped back, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. The clearing was silent, the stone hidden beneath the earth, its power contained for now. But as they turned to leave, Jack felt a faint whisper at the edge of his mind, a voice that sent a chill down his spine. This is not the end. He looked at Elena, seeing the same realization in her eyes. The stone's influence was still with them, lingering in their memories, a reminder of what they had uncovered, of what they could never fully escape. As they left the jungle, returning to civilization, they carried with them the weight of that final whisper, the knowledge that the stone's secrets were far from buried. They had contained it, yes, but they knew that someday, someone else would find it, drawn by the same lure, the same ancient call. And as they walked into the fading light, Jack wondered if they would ever truly be free of the stone, or if it had bound itself to them forever, leaving them as guardians of a secret too powerful to remain hidden, a relic of a world that refused to be forgotten.